"Don't, it still hurts there." The giant Apache girl said. The lone rancher. The sun hung low in the Arizona sky, painting the desert with shades of gold and orange. The wide, open plains seemed endless, stretching beyond the eye, dotted with dry shrubs and jagged rocks. The wind whispered across the sand, carrying with it the faint smell of sage and dust. In this quiet, solitary land, Eli Parker worked his small cattle ranch, the sweat on his brow and the ache in his muscles, a constant reminder of the hard life he had chosen. Eli had grown used to being alone. Years ago, he had tried living in towns, seeking company and comfort, but the bustling streets and crowded houses had never felt like home. Here, with the desert surrounding him, he found peace in solitude. He knew every stone, every path, every twist of the river that fed his ranch. Every morning he walked among his cattle, checking their health and counting them carefully. Every evening he repaired fences or mended broken tools. Life was simple, but it was honest. On one quiet evening, as Eli filled the water troughs for his cattle, he noticed something strange. The sand near the trough was disturbed, and the footprints left behind were unlike anything he had ever seen. They were large, much larger than a man's, and human in shape. He frowned and crouched down to examine them. The prints were deep, as if the owner had carried great weight, and the toes were long and well-formed. Eli had lived in the desert all his life and had seen many things: coyotes, snakes, even the occasional wandering traveler. But these prints belonged to someone or something extraordinary. For the rest of the day, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every rustle of the wind in the shrubs, every shadow cast by the setting sun, seemed alive. He checked his fences twice, scanned the horizon, and even called out softly, "Hello, anyone there?" But only the wind answered. Still, a small part of him was curious, a spark of something he had not felt in years, a mixture of fear and wonder. That night, Eli sat on his porch, a lantern casting warm light over the wooden boards. The desert night was silent, save for the distant howl of a coyote. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sipped it slowly, thinking about the prints. Who could be out here, and why? He had no answer, only questions that kept him awake. He looked at the stars above, the Milky Way stretching like a river across the sky, and for a moment he felt small and unimportant, but strangely alive. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight touched the desert floor, Eli saw her. A massive figure moved among the rocks at the edge of his property. She was tall, taller than any person he had ever seen, and her presence was commanding. She moved with ease, like a part of the desert itself, and when she stepped closer, Eli noticed her eyes, sharp, dark, and filled with a quiet sadness. She introduced herself as Ahioka. The name was soft on the tongue but carried weight, as if it had been spoken for generations. She explained that she was a descendant of the Apache people, a lineage that had endured centuries of struggle and displacement. Her voice was calm, but there was an intensity beneath it, a sense that she had lived through more than her years suggested. Eli noticed that she did not carry any belongings. She came empty-handed, as if the desert had been her home long before his ranch had existed. Eli was cautious. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten how to trust easily. But there was something in Ahioka's presence that softened his fear. He offered her water and a simple meal, watching her eat in silence. She did not speak much, but when she did, her words were careful, measured, and meaningful. Eli felt an unusual connection forming, a bridge between two people who were both survivors in their own ways. Days passed, and Ahioka remained near the ranch. She moved with grace, almost blending into the desert around her, yet her size made her impossible to ignore. Eli observed her from a distance at first, curious about her habits and the way she interacted with the land. She would walk along the riverbed, crouching to examine plants, sometimes speaking softly as if conversing with spirits unseen. Eli respected her solitude, giving her space but always keeping an eye on her for safety. One afternoon, while Eli was repairing a broken fence post, Ahioka approached him quietly. "The land is strong," she said, her voice carrying across the open space. "But it is wounded like me?" Eli paused, hammer in hand, unsure what she meant. She simply smiled faintly, then walked away, leaving him with a strange mixture of confusion and curiosity. He had met many people in his life, but none spoke in this way, with layers hidden beneath every word. As the weeks went on, Eli noticed her watching the cattle, helping him in small, quiet ways. She would lift heavy bales of hay with ease, her long arms moving as if they were an extension of the earth. But there were moments when she would stop, place her hand on a rock or a tree, and close her eyes. Her expression would shift, pain flickering across her features before she regained her calm composure. Eli began to understand that her struggles were not just physical. They were memories, emotions, a past that refused to leave her. One evening after a long day under the sun, Eli asked, "Are you hurt?" He had seen her wince earlier, a small movement that spoke of discomfort. Ahioka looked at him, her eyes dark and deep, and whispered, "Don't, it still hurts there." Eli felt a shiver run down his spine. She was not speaking of a scrape or a bruise. This was something deeper, something invisible yet heavy. He nodded slowly, realizing that some wounds could not be seen but could still affect the soul profoundly. Their bond grew, silent but strong. Eli found himself talking to her about things he had never shared with anyone, his fears, regrets, and moments of loneliness. And in return, Ahioka began to share fragments of her story, pieces of her family history, the hardships of her ancestors, and the pain that had been carried down for generations. It was not an easy conversation. Many times they both sat in silence, letting the weight of their words settle like dust on the desert floor. One morning, a hawk circled overhead as Eli and Ahioka walked along a narrow canyon path. "Do you always travel alone?" Eli asked. Ahioka shook her head. "I am not alone. The land is my family. The spirits guide me, and they never leave." Eli thought about his own solitude and how different it felt from hers. She was never truly alone because she carried the history of those before her. He realized that she was not just a visitor, she was a living connection to something older, something enduring, something that the desert had never forgotten. Time passed, and the routines of the ranch became shared. Ahioka helped with the cattle, gathered firewood, and moved like a shadow across the land, always aware, always present. Yet, in quiet moments, she would disappear for hours, leaving Eli to wonder where she went and what thoughts occupied her mind. He learned not to ask too much, for some stories could not be hurried and some pain could not be explained. One night the desert sky exploded with stars, and Eli and Ahioka sat side by side on a large flat rock, sharing the warmth of a small fire. Eli poured coffee into 2 mugs, offering one to her. She accepted it with a small nod, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "The desert teaches patience," she said softly. "It teaches that the past is always with us, but it does not have to control us." Eli listened, feeling the truth of her words. He had spent years fighting the land and his own solitude, but perhaps he had misunderstood what strength really meant. The days continued, each one blending into the next, filled with small routines and quiet discoveries. Eli found himself looking forward to Ahioka's presence, and he realized that the loneliness that had defined his life was slowly being replaced by something else: trust, understanding, and a shared rhythm with the land. The desert was still vast and unforgiving, but now it felt alive, welcoming, and full of stories yet to be told. And so, life on the ranch settled into a delicate balance. Eli and Ahioka existed together in a world of silence and spoken words, of shared work and unspoken understanding. She remained a mystery, a giant figure walking through the desert with strength and vulnerability intertwined. And he, a solitary rancher, found in her presence a mirror for his own heart, a reflection of pain, resilience, and the quiet possibility of connection. Little did they know, their encounter was only the beginning of a journey that would test their courage, reveal hidden strengths, and uncover truths about themselves and the land they both loved. But for now, they watched the sun dip below the mesas, feeling the desert breathe around them, carrying both their pasts and their hopes into the endless horizon. Days turned into weeks on Eli Parker's ranch, and life began to take on a rhythm that neither he nor Ahioka had expected. The desert was harsh and unyielding, yet in its quiet way, it offered lessons to those willing to notice. Eli had always been a man of routines, but now, with Ahioka nearby, even small tasks felt different. There was a new energy in the air, a presence that was both comforting and mysterious. Ahioka spent her mornings walking along the riverbed that ran near the ranch, checking the water and observing the plants that thrived despite the dryness. She moved with grace, her tall figure almost blending into the desert landscape, yet impossible to miss. Eli often watched her from a distance, admiring the strength she carried, but also sensing the fragility hidden beneath it. She was like the desert itself, strong, enduring, yet touched by past storms that left invisible scars. One morning, Eli noticed Ahioka pausing near a cluster of rocks. She crouched low, examining a small cactus that had broken under the weight of the sun. She gently touched the plant, her long fingers brushing the spines with surprising care. Eli approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "It seems like you understand everything in this desert," he said, half teasing, half curious. Ahioka looked up, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "I listen," she said softly. "The land has stories. It remembers the people who walked here before. It remembers the pain and the joy. Sometimes, if you listen carefully, it will speak to you." Eli nodded, unsure if he truly understood. He had lived in this desert all his life, but he had never thought of it as a storyteller. For him, it had always been work, survival, and silence. Yet something in Ahioka's presence made him see the land differently, as if it was alive in ways he had never noticed before. Their days began to pass with a quiet companionship. Ahioka helped Eli with the cattle, moving through the pens with surprising ease. She was strong and capable, lifting heavy feed bags and mending fences alongside him. Eli had always been proud of his independence, but he realized that working together with her made even the hardest tasks seem lighter. They communicated with gestures and small words, often speaking less and understanding more. One afternoon, Eli noticed her wince while lifting a bale of hay. "Are you okay?" he asked, stepping closer. Ahioka shook her head slightly, her face calm but her eyes distant. "Don't, it still hurts there," she murmured. Eli felt a pang in his chest. He had begun to understand that her pain was not always visible, that her body carried memories as much as her mind. He reached out instinctively, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder, but she simply nodded, accepting the gesture without a word. As the days went on, Eli noticed more moments like this, small flashes of pain, moments when Ahioka would pause and close her eyes, her face shadowed with memories she did not speak aloud. He learned not to pry, understanding that some wounds were not meant to be revealed immediately. Instead, he offered silent support, carrying feed bags, fixing fences, or simply sitting nearby while she tended the land. Evenings were the most revealing. They would often sit on a large, flat rock near the river, watching the sun sink below the mesas. The sky turned brilliant shades of orange and pink, and the desert stretched endlessly in every direction. Sometimes they spoke quietly about the past. Ahioka shared stories of her ancestors, of families forced to leave their homes, of struggles that had lasted generations. Eli, in turn, spoke of his own loneliness, the loss of friends, and the hard life of a rancher in the unforgiving desert. One evening, Ahioka shared a memory that made Eli pause. "My grandmother used to tell me about the old Apache ways," she said. "She said that pain is like the wind. You cannot see it, but you feel it everywhere, and sometimes it carries messages you cannot ignore." Eli listened carefully. He had never thought of pain in this way, not as an enemy, but as a messenger. He felt a deep respect for her, for the way she carried both her strength and her suffering without complaint. Their bond grew stronger, built on mutual understanding rather than words. Eli began to notice little things. How Ahioka's eyes softened when a young calf struggled to stand, how she would whistle softly while mending fences, or how she sometimes talked to the rocks and trees as if they could answer back. At first he thought it strange, but he soon realized it was her way of connecting with the world, of finding balance in a life filled with challenges. One particularly hot afternoon, Eli and Ahioka worked together to move a stubborn cow back into the pen. The animal resisted, pushing against them with surprising force. Eli grunted as he tried to guide it, sweat running down his face. Ahioka stepped beside him, placing her hands firmly on the cow's back. With a few calm words and gentle nudges, she managed to guide it into the pen. Eli looked at her in awe. She was not just strong, she was patient, observant, and in tune with the living creatures around her in a way he had never been. Later that evening, as they rested near the fire, Eli asked, "How did you learn all of this? How do you know what to do?" Ahioka stared into the flames, her face flickering in the firelight. "It is not just knowledge," she said slowly. "It is memory, not just mine but my family's. Our ancestors lived in these lands. They knew how to survive, how to respect the earth. I only listen and follow." Eli nodded, feeling a mix of admiration and humility. He had thought himself a capable man, able to survive anything the desert threw at him. But now he realized that survival was more than skill. It was wisdom, patience, and understanding the silent language of the land. Despite their growing closeness, there were moments of tension. Ahioka's presence was commanding, and her independence sometimes clashed with Eli's quiet routines. There were times when she wandered far into the desert, leaving him worried and anxious. Yet he learned to trust her instincts, to respect her space, and to understand that freedom and companionship could coexist. One morning, while the sky was still tinged with the soft pink of dawn, Eli noticed Ahioka kneeling beside a small, dry riverbed. She traced patterns in the sand with her fingers, her face shadowed with thought. "What are you doing?" he asked quietly, not wanting to interrupt. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with both sadness and resolve. "Remembering," she said. "Sometimes the land holds memories and I have to acknowledge them." Eli watched her in silence. He had never thought of the desert as a keeper of memories. To him, it had always been a place of work, survival, and solitude. But now, through Ahioka's eyes, he began to see it differently, as a living record of everything that had come before, carrying stories of joy and sorrow alike. As the weeks turned into a month, Eli found that he was changing. The loneliness that had defined him was slowly lifting, replaced by a quiet companionship and trust. He looked forward to Ahioka's presence, to her observations, to the way she moved through the land with purpose and care. And he noticed subtle changes in her as well, moments of laughter, a softer gaze, and a willingness to share fragments of her past that she had once kept tightly sealed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, Eli and Ahioka sat side by side on a rock. A cool breeze swept across the plains, carrying the scent of sage and earth. Eli broke the comfortable silence. "Does it still hurt?" he asked gently, remembering the words she had whispered weeks ago. Ahioka looked at him, her gaze steady but distant. "Sometimes," she admitted softly, "but not as much. The land, it helps." Eli understood. He realized that pain was not something that disappeared entirely, but it could become lighter, more bearable, when shared, understood, and acknowledged. And for the first time in years, he felt hope. Hope that even wounds that never fully healed could coexist with trust, companionship, and the slow, steady rhythm of life in the desert. As night fell and the stars began to shimmer across the sky, Eli and Ahioka sat quietly, letting the vastness of the desert surround them. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it the echoes of the past, the resilience of the present, and the promise of tomorrow. They were two souls bound by circumstance, by shared work, and by the quiet understanding that pain, memory, and healing could all exist together. And so, life on the ranch continued, full of work, small joys, quiet lessons, and an ever-deepening bond. Each day brought challenges, but also understanding. Each evening brought reflection and subtle growth. Eli Parker, the lone rancher, and Ahioka, the towering Apache descendant, had found in each other a rare kind of companionship, a meeting of strength, wisdom, and the silent acknowledgement of the past. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a living, breathing companion that carried their stories, their pain, and their quiet hope. And in that vast, unforgiving land, Eli and Ahioka began to learn not just how to survive, but how to live, together and yet fully themselves. The summer sun rose harshly over the Arizona desert, casting sharp shadows across Eli Parker's ranch. The days were hotter than usual, and the river that had always provided water for the cattle had begun to dry. The desert, once generous in small ways, now seemed unforgiving. Eli wiped sweat from his brow as he walked along the riverbed, checking the water level. It was lower than he had ever seen it, exposing cracked earth and stubborn stones. The cattle were restless, searching for shade and water, and Eli felt a knot tighten in his chest. Ahioka appeared silently at his side, her presence both calming and commanding. She had been walking along the riverbed herself, checking for signs of life, and her eyes immediately caught the changes in the water. "It is worse than I thought," she said softly, kneeling to touch the parched soil. "The land is thirsty and the animals feel it too." Eli nodded, grateful for her sharp observation. He had always been able to survive the desert, but he had never faced such a relentless dry spell before. Together, they assessed the situation. The river was shrinking fast, and some of the smaller water holes had disappeared completely. Without intervention, many of Eli's cattle would not survive. He knew he needed a solution, and quickly. Ahioka studied the land carefully, her eyes tracing the contours of the canyon walls and the narrow gullies carved by rain long ago. "There is a spring," she said finally. "Hidden, protected, few know its location. My people used it in the past. It could save your cattle." Eli's heart lifted slightly, but he knew the journey to find the spring would not be easy. The canyon paths were treacherous, filled with loose rocks, steep inclines, and sudden drops. It had been years since he had ventured that far into the desert, and he knew that one wrong step could lead to disaster. Still, there was no other choice. "Then we go," he said firmly. "We have to try." The following morning, before the sun could rise fully, Eli and Ahioka set out. They carried small supplies of water and food, enough for a day or two, knowing that the desert could be unforgiving if they miscalculated. As they walked, the heat began to climb, pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. The path was uneven, forcing Eli to watch every step, while Ahioka moved almost effortlessly over the rocks, her long legs and strong frame giving her a clear advantage. Despite her strength, Eli noticed moments when she paused, her breathing deep and her face shadowed with strain. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Ahioka shook her head slightly but did not complain. "The desert tests everyone," she said quietly. "Even those who seem strong must respect it." Eli nodded, understanding that her strength did not make her invincible. It made her aware of limits, a lesson he had learned the hard way over many years. As they climbed higher into the canyon, the heat became more intense. The rocks radiated the sun's energy, and the narrow path offered little shade. Eli felt his muscles ache and his throat dry, but he pressed on, motivated by the thought of saving his cattle. He glanced at Ahioka, who had removed her wide-brimmed hat and let the sun beat down on her dark hair. She was focused, alert, and seemingly unaffected by the heat, yet he could sense the effort she was exerting. By midday, they reached a steep rock ledge. The path narrowed dangerously, and Eli had to hold onto the rough stone to keep his balance. A single misstep could send him tumbling down the canyon wall. Ahioka moved ahead, guiding him with soft instructions and careful gestures. "Step here," she said, pointing to a stable rock. "Use your hands, trust the stones." Eli followed, his trust in her growing with every step. He realized that survival was not just about strength, but about guidance, patience, and teamwork. Hours passed, and the journey tested them in ways neither expected. They faced sudden rock slides where small stones tumbled down the slope, narrowly missing them. The sun was relentless, and their water supply was dwindling. Eli could see the strain in Ahioka's movements, the way her shoulders stiffened and her pace slowed slightly. He offered her water, and she accepted it with a small nod, her eyes never leaving the rocky path ahead. At one point, Ahioka stumbled over a loose stone and fell to the ground. Eli was instantly at her side, helping her up. She brushed herself off and smiled faintly, but Eli noticed the subtle grimace of pain on her face. "It's nothing," she said softly. "Keep going." "We are close." Eli shook his head. "It's not nothing, you don't have to carry it alone." She looked at him, and for a moment, her usual calmness softened into something more vulnerable. Eli felt a deep respect for her courage and the hidden pain she bore silently. Finally, as the afternoon sun began to lower, they reached a narrow canyon entrance. Ahioka's eyes lit up with recognition. "The spring is just beyond this path," she said. Her voice carried a mixture of relief and reverence. They moved carefully, descending a final set of rocky steps. And there it was, a small, clear pool of water surrounded by rocks and shaded by a few resilient trees. The water sparkled like glass, a hidden treasure in the harsh desert. Eli knelt beside it, scooping water into his hands and letting it trickle over his face. The coolness was a blessing, a moment of relief after hours of struggle. He looked at Ahioka, who was sitting quietly by the edge of the pool, her hands resting on her knees. She had a small, content smile on her face, but Eli could sense the exhaustion in her posture. She had given everything to get them here, and he felt a deep gratitude. They stayed at the spring for a short while, drinking water and resting in the shade. Eli filled his small water containers, thinking about the cattle and the journey back. "We can lead the herd here," he said. "It will save them." Ahioka nodded. "Yes, but we must be careful. The desert will test us on the way back as well." The return journey was even more difficult. The sun had moved, casting long shadows that made the path harder to see. The rocks were hotter now, and the dry wind stung their skin. Eli had to help Ahioka at times, lifting her over loose boulders and supporting her when the ground was unstable. She accepted his help silently, her trust in him growing as much as his trust in her. By the time they reached the edge of the canyon, the sun was beginning to set. The sky was painted in brilliant reds and purples, and the desert stretched endlessly in every direction. Eli and Ahioka looked at each other, sharing a quiet moment of accomplishment. They had survived the harsh journey together, relying on trust, patience, and their combined strength. Once they returned to the ranch, Eli led the cattle to the spring, and Ahioka helped guide them carefully. The animals drank eagerly, their thirst finally quenched. Eli watched the scene, feeling a profound sense of relief and pride. It was not just about the water. It was about survival, trust, and the bond that had grown between him and Ahioka through adversity. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Eli poured coffee into 2 mugs and handed one to Ahioka. They sat in silence for a while, letting the desert night envelop them. The stars began to appear one by one, shining brightly over the wide plains. "You are stronger than I realized," Eli said quietly. Ahioka smiled faintly. "Strength is not just about muscle. It is about knowing when to ask for help, when to trust, and when to keep moving forward despite pain." Eli nodded. He had learned that lesson the hard way on the canyon path. He also realized that Ahioka's words carried more than physical meaning. They were about life, resilience, and understanding one's own limits. He felt a deep respect for her wisdom, and for the quiet courage she carried every day. Over the next few weeks, the ranch began to recover. The spring provided enough water for the cattle, and the animals grew calmer and healthier. Eli and Ahioka settled into a routine again, their bond strengthened by the challenges they had faced together. They spoke more openly about their pasts, their fears, and their hopes for the future. Every story, every shared memory deepened their connection. Ahioka occasionally wandered alone into the desert, communing with the land and the spirits of her ancestors. Eli learned to read the subtle signs of her moods, understanding when she needed space and when she wanted company. And each time she returned, she carried a quiet calm with her, a sense of balance that seemed to flow from the desert itself. One evening, as the sun set behind the mesas, Eli looked at Ahioka and asked, "Does it still hurt?" She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the last light of the day. "Sometimes," she said softly, "but not as much. The journey teaches you patience, and the land teaches you resilience." Eli smiled faintly, feeling the truth in her words. In the end, the drought and the desert's challenges had tested them both, but they had survived together. They had learned the value of trust, teamwork, and quiet courage. And as they stood side by side, watching the sun disappear behind the horizon, they understood that survival was not just about enduring hardships. It was about finding strength in one another and discovering the deeper lessons that life and the desert had to offer. The desert night embraced them, carrying both the memory of struggle and the promise of hope. Eli and Ahioka, 2 souls from different worlds, had faced the harshest challenges together and emerged stronger, more understanding, and bound by the quiet, unspoken trust that only comes from shared hardship. The desert had grown quiet again. After the long, grueling weeks of drought and the dangerous journey to the hidden spring, Eli Parker's ranch had begun to thrive once more. The cattle were healthy, grazing calmly under the warm sun, and the once cracked earth near the river had begun to show signs of life, small green shoots breaking through the soil. The air itself felt lighter, carrying a subtle fragrance of sage and earth that promised new beginnings. Eli moved among the cattle, checking on each one with practiced care, yet his mind often drifted to Ahioka. She had been quiet for much of the day, tending to the garden he had recently planted near the ranch house. Her movements were precise and careful, almost meditative, as if she were communicating with the land itself. Eli had grown used to her presence beside him, but now he noticed every gesture, every shadow of emotion in her eyes. Ahioka looked up and noticed him watching her. She gave a small, almost shy smile, one that seemed to carry both pride and relief. The desert had tested them, pushed them to their limits, and yet here they were, stronger, closer, and more connected than ever. She set aside the tools she had been using and walked toward him. The sunlight glinted off the few bracelets on her wrists, and her long hair moved gently with the breeze. Eli felt a strange mixture of awe and tenderness. He had lived most of his life in solitude, believing that independence was the only way to survive. But Ahioka had taught him that strength also came from trust, from allowing someone else to walk beside you through challenges. "The ranch looks good," he said quietly. "Thanks to you." Ahioka shook her head. "It is not just me, it is both of us. We worked together, we listened. The land gave us guidance too." Her words were soft yet firm, filled with wisdom. Eli nodded, realizing the truth in them. Every lesson they had learned about patience, resilience, and survival had been shared. They had carried each other through hardships, and in the process, they had begun to heal parts of themselves that neither had spoken about openly. Evenings on the ranch had become a time of quiet reflection. Eli and Ahioka would sit on the large rock near the river, watching the sun sink behind the distant mesas. The sky would turn shades of gold, pink, and purple, casting long shadows over the land. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they sat in silence, letting the desert speak for them. And in those moments, Eli felt something he had not felt in years: peace. One evening, as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Eli asked, "Does it still hurt?" He had asked before, during their first days together, and her answer had always carried a weight of quiet sadness. But now he sensed a difference in her. Ahioka looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight, and smiled faintly. "Sometimes," she said softly, "but not as much. The land, the journey, and your company, they all help. I feel lighter than I did before." Eli felt a warmth spread through his chest. He understood that her pain would never fully vanish, but it could coexist with hope, trust, and connection. The healing was not sudden, nor was it complete, but it was real, and that was enough. He reached out and gently touched her hand, and she did not pull away. For the first time, Eli felt the depth of their bond, built not on words alone, but on shared experiences and mutual understanding. Over the next few weeks, the ranch settled into a comfortable routine. Ahioka continued to explore the desert on her own sometimes, walking among the rocks, listening to the whispers of the wind, and paying homage to the spirits of her ancestors. Eli learned to watch for the subtle signs that indicated when she needed space and when she sought companionship. Their trust had grown so much that neither needed to speak to understand the other. One morning, as the sun rose in a soft haze, Eli noticed Ahioka sitting quietly by a small cactus, her hands resting on the earth. She looked deep in thought, and he approached her slowly. "Are you remembering something?" he asked gently. She nodded, her eyes reflecting a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "Yes," she said softly. "The desert holds memories. Some of them are painful, but acknowledging them helps me carry them without letting them control me." Eli listened in silence. He had seen her struggle through invisible pain, moments when the weight of her past pressed down on her despite her strength. Yet here she was, calm and composed, learning to live alongside her memories rather than being consumed by them. Eli realized that this was a lesson not just for Ahioka, but for himself as well. He, too, had past regrets and losses that he had carried silently, and now he saw that healing required acceptance and courage. Life on the ranch grew richer. The land responded to their care. The garden flourished, the cattle thrived, and the desert seemed to breathe around them. Ahioka taught Eli small lessons about the natural world, pointing out which plants were edible, which stones indicated water, and how the animals sensed changes in weather. Eli found himself fascinated, absorbing knowledge he had never sought before. And in return, he shared practical skills with her: how to mend fences quickly, how to tend to a sick calf, and how to navigate the desert safely during harsh weather. One afternoon, a young calf became stuck in a narrow ravine near the river. Eli rushed to help, but it was Ahioka's calm voice and steady hands that guided the animal to safety. She knelt beside it, murmuring softly as if the words themselves carried reassurance. Eli watched, silently grateful for her presence and the unique strength she offered. He had always thought he was capable alone, but he realized that real strength came from working together, from understanding each other's strengths and vulnerabilities. Evenings continued to be their time of reflection. One night, as the stars blanketed the sky and the desert cooled, Eli spoke softly. "I used to think being alone made me strong, but I was wrong. I see now that we are stronger when we share the burden." Ahioka nodded, her eyes soft but wise. "Yes," she said. "The past does not disappear and pain may remain, but together we learn to carry it, to understand it, and to keep moving forward." They shared stories of their pasts, but now there was less sadness in the telling. Eli spoke of his childhood on the ranch, the friends he had lost, and the long nights spent alone in the desert. Ahioka shared stories of her family, the struggles of her ancestors, and the memories that had shaped her life. Yet there was a sense of peace in their words now, a quiet acceptance that allowed them to connect deeply without fear or hesitation. One morning, Ahioka wandered a little farther into the desert than usual, moving with her usual grace and calm. Eli followed at a safe distance, curious about her path. She stopped at a rocky outcrop, looking out over the vast desert, her eyes reflecting both determination and reflection. Eli approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt her moment. She turned to him and smiled faintly. "The desert teaches patience and understanding," she said softly. "It reminds me of who I am and where I come from, and now it teaches me that I am not alone." Eli felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had learned so much from her, not just survival skills or knowledge of the land, but lessons about resilience, compassion, and the importance of connection. The desert had been a teacher for both of them, testing their endurance and shaping their spirits, but it had also given them each other. As the days continued, Eli and Ahioka's bond became stronger and more unspoken. They worked together, laughed together, and shared moments of quiet understanding. Pain remained, as it always would, but it no longer defined them. Instead, they had found a way to live with it, to honor it, and to allow it to guide them without controlling them. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant mesas, Eli turned to Ahioka. "I am glad you are here," he said simply. She looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. "So am I," she replied softly. "The land, the journey, the hardships, they brought us here. And for that I am grateful." They stood side by side, watching the desert stretch endlessly before them. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and earth, and the stars began to shimmer above. Eli felt a sense of completion, a quiet satisfaction that came not from victory or achievement, but from understanding, connection, and the slow, steady process of healing. The desert night embraced them, carrying both the memory of struggle and the promise of hope. Eli and Ahioka, two souls shaped by hardship and history, had found in each other a rare and precious companionship. Pain, memory, and resilience coexisted with trust, understanding, and quiet joy. The past had not disappeared, but it no longer ruled their present. And so life on the ranch continued, filled with work, shared moments, reflection, and laughter. The desert remained vast and mysterious, a teacher and witness to their journey. Eli and Ahioka had faced challenges, endured hardships, and carried wounds that would never fully heal. But they had done so together, and in doing so, they had discovered the quiet power of connection, trust, and understanding. In the end, the story of Eli Parker, the lone rancher, and Ahioka, the towering Apache descendant, was not one of conquest or victory over the land. It was a story of resilience, empathy, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The desert had tested them, but it had also healed them. And as they stood together, watching the last light fade into the endless horizon, they knew that they had found something far greater than survival. They had found peace, companionship, and hope.